June 19, 1944, 23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, 210 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrasiu checks his rearview mirror for the fourth time in 30 seconds and sees exactly what he expected. Nothing but empty sky and the distant silhouettes of his wingmen holding formation. The Combat Air Patrol has been circling for 90 minutes above Task Force 58, and the morning sun has already baked the inside of his Grumman F6F Hellcat cockpit to nearly 100 degrees. His radio crackles with the voice of the fighter director officer aboard the carrier Lexington, suddenly urgent, clipped, professional. All Dagwood units, this is base. We have trade inbound, bearing 270, altitude Angels 24, range 90 miles. Vector 270 and intercept. Acknowledged? Vrasiu responds immediately, banking his Hellcat hard left toward the western horizon. Dagwood leader, Roger, 270, Angels 24. He advances his throttle and feels the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine surge, pushing 2,000 horsepower through 18 cylinders. The Hellcat accelerates smoothly, climbing steadily toward 24,000 feet. Within minutes, he spots them. A formation of Japanese carrier aircraft, Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers escorted by Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, perhaps 50 aircraft total, heading directly toward the American invasion fleet anchored off Saipan. The Japanese pilots are flying in tight, disciplined formation. They have not yet seen the approaching Hellcats diving from above with the sun behind them. Vrasiu selects his first target, a zero-flying protective cover on the left flank of the bomber formation. The Japanese fighter appears sleek and graceful, its distinctive low-wing configuration immediately recognizable. Vrasiu knows this aircraft intimately. Every American naval aviator in the Pacific has studied, captured examples, memorized performance specifications, learned its strengths and fatal weaknesses. He knows the Zero can outturn his Hellcat in slow-speed maneuvering. He knows it can climb faster from low altitude. He knows its 20mm cannon can shred an aircraft if the pilot achieves proper firing position. He also knows none of that matters if he follows his training precisely. Vrasiu dives from superior altitude, building speed to 380 miles per hour. The Zero pilot spots the threat too late, banking hard left in a desperate defensive turn. The Japanese pilot is trying to force a turning engagement at low speed, where the Zero's legendary agility might save him. Vrasiu ignores the turn completely. He maintains his diving attack angle, closes to 200 yards, and squeezes his trigger for exactly 2 seconds. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, fire simultaneously. 80 rounds per second converge on Zero's lightweight aluminum airframe. The Japanese fighter disintegrates instantly, the thin aluminum skin measuring just 0.032 inches thick, offering no resistance whatsoever to armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. The Zero breaks apart in mid-air, trailing flame and debris. Vrasiu pulls out of his dive, uses his excess speed to zoom, climb back above the fight, selects another target, and repeats the process. Dive, shoot, extend, climb. Never turn. Never slow down. Never engage on the enemy's terms. In exactly 8 minutes of combat, Alex Vrasiu shoots down 6 Japanese aircraft. 6 confirmed kills in 8 minutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Vrasiu lands back aboard Lexington 90 minutes later with his guns empty and his aircraft undamaged except for minor flak damage to his left wing, he reports to the debriefing officer with a precision that reflects his engineering education. 6 enemy aircraft destroyed. Ammunition expended, 2,400 rounds. Fuel remaining, 75 gallons. Aircraft condition, fully operational. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't exaggerate. He simply describes what happened with the clinical detachment of a man who has just executed a tactical procedure exactly as trained. The debriefing officer records the information carefully and adds Vrasiu's results to the growing tally from the day's combat operations. By sunset on June 19th, Task Force 58 will report 330 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 23 American losses. The engagement will become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it will effectively end Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force in the Pacific War. But the story of how American Hellcat pilots achieved such catastrophic superiority over Zero fighters begins not in the skies above Saipan. In June 1944, but 2 years earlier in the desperate autumn of 1942, when Japanese pilots controlled the Pacific skies so completely that American fighter doctrine consisted of one brutally simple instruction: avoid combat whenever possible. December 7th, 1941, Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, Oahu, Hawaii. The Zero fighter made its introduction to American military consciousness in the most violent way imaginable. The first wave of Japanese carrier aircraft attacking Pearl Harbor included 43 A6M2 Zero fighters, providing escort and conducting strafing attacks on American airfields. American pilots watching from the ground as Zeros destroyed their parked aircraft felt genuine awe mixed with terror. The Japanese fighters moved with impossible grace and speed. They climbed at angles that seemed to defy physics. They turned inside any defensive maneuver American pilots attempted. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, controlling the engagement geometry completely. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Zero fighters dominated every aerial engagement across the Pacific theater. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zeros shot down 66 American aircraft while losing only 17 of their own. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Zero pilots claimed dozens of American torpedo bombers and fighters, despite losing 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. American fighter pilots flying Grumman F6F Wildcats returned from combat with stories that sounded like mythology. The Zero could climb faster than anything with wings. It could turn tighter than physics should allow. Japanese pilots demonstrated flying skills that seemed superhuman, executing maneuvers that would kill lesser aviators through G-force-induced unconsciousness. The mystique surrounding the Zero in 1942 was not propaganda or American defeatism. It was based on harsh mathematical reality. The A6M2 Zero weighed 5,555 pounds, fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot. The F4F4 Wildcat weighed 7,426 pounds under identical conditions. The Zero was 1,871 pounds lighter than its primary American opponent. That weight advantage translated directly into performance superiority in every metric that mattered in air combat. The Zero's wing loading measured 24.3 pounds per square foot. The Wildcat carried 28.6 pounds per square foot. Lower wing loading meant the Zero could sustain tighter turning radius at any given airspeed, a decisive tactical advantage in traditional dogfighting. The Zero climbed at 3,100 feet per minute in optimal conditions. The Wildcat managed 1,950 feet per minute maximum, and in actual combat conditions with full ammunition and fuel load, pilots consistently reported climb rates below 1,000 feet per minute. The Zero achieved these extraordinary performance characteristics through ruthlessly systematic weight reduction implemented by Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi and his design team at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Every component, every system, every structural element had been examined for weight savings opportunities. The result was an aircraft that represented the absolute extreme of lightweight fighter design. The aluminum skin covering the Zero's fuselage and wings measured just 0.032 inches thick, barely 60% as thick as American minimum standards of 0.04 to 0.050 inches. The aircraft carried zero armor protection for the pilot, no steel plate behind the seat, no armored glass in the windscreen, no protective shields around the engine or oil cooler. The fuel tanks were simple aluminum containers with no self-sealing capability. A single incendiary bullet would puncture them and ignite the fuel instantly. But, in 1942, With experienced Japanese pilots who had trained for thousands of hours before the war, these vulnerabilities didn't matter. Japanese aviators used their aircraft's superior maneuverability to avoid getting hit in the first place. They controlled engagement geometry, attacking from advantageous positions and disengaging before American pilots could respond effectively. The psychological impact on American naval aviation was devastating. Fighter squadron commanders issued standing orders that reflected the grim reality. When encountering Zeros, maintain maximum speed, avoid turning engagements, and disengage if outnumbered. The unofficial translation was simpler and more brutal. Run away if you can. Marine pilots defending Guadalcanal in August 1942 through February 1943 learned through bloody experience that attempting to turn with a Zero was suicide. Army Air Force pilots flying P-40 Warhawks in China faced similar tactical constraints. The Zero dominated the Pacific Air War so completely that Japanese pilots developed a dangerous overconfidence, a conviction that their aircraft's superiority was permanent and unchallengeable. Japanese pilot training manuals from early 1943 reflect this confidence explicitly. Zero pilots were instructed to exploit their aircraft's turning ability aggressively, to force American fighters into slow-speed maneuvering combat, where Japanese superiority was absolute. The doctrine emphasized individual pilot skill and aircraft agility as the decisive factors in aerial combat. Japanese tactical theory in 1943 remained rooted in the samurai tradition of personal combat prowess, one-on-one dueling, where superior skill and superior equipment would inevitably triumph. This doctrine had worked brilliantly from December 1941 through mid-1943. Japanese pilots had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 in many engagements. The Zero's reputation as the finest fighter aircraft in the world seemed justified by statistical reality. But that reality was about to collide with American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and a new fighter designed specifically to exploit every weakness the Zero possessed. January 16, 1943. Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. Navy test pilot Lieutenant Commander Melvin Hoffman completes his final evaluation flight in a captured A6M20 that had been recovered from Akutan Island in Alaska and meticulously restored for testing. Hoffman has spent weeks flying mock combat trials against various American fighters, systematically documenting the Zero's capabilities and limitations. His comprehensive technical report confirms what combat veterans already suspected through bitter experience. The Zero is genuinely invincible in slow-speed turning combat below 250 miles per hour. No American fighter can match it under those specific conditions. But the report also details severe, exploitable weaknesses that had been hidden by Japanese tactical doctrine and pilot skill. At speeds above 200 knots indicated airspeed, approximately 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons become dramatically heavy. Rolling the aircraft requires significant physical force from the pilot. Rolling to the right requires noticeably more effort than rolling left, creating exploitable lateral asymmetry. At 250 knots, approximately 288 miles per hour, rolling the Zero to the right becomes nearly impossible without hydraulic boost, which the aircraft doesn't possess. The engine's float-type carburetor fails completely under negative G forces during diving maneuvers. When the pilot pushes forward on the control stick into a dive, the engine dies instantly as fuel flow stops. The engine restarts automatically once positive pressure returns, but for several critical seconds, the Zero becomes an unpowered glider. The thin aluminum skin cannot withstand sustained high-speed maneuvering without risk of structural failure. Attempting violent rolling maneuvers above 250 knots risks catastrophic wing separation. Hoffman's report concludes with tactical recommendations that would revolutionize American fighter doctrine. Maintain speed above 250 miles per hour at all times. Never attempt to turn with the Zero at low speeds under any circumstances. Use altitude advantage to make slashing diving attacks at high speed. Fire concentrated bursts at close range, then dive away immediately using negative G if pursued. Zoom, climb back to altitude using excess speed gained in the dive. Roll hard right at high speed when defensive. If the Zero attempts to follow, it cannot match American roll rates. The tactical revolution was elegantly simple. Fight only at high speed where the Zero is mechanically vulnerable. Refuse. Absolutely to fight at low speed where the Zero dominates. American pilots could impose their own advantageous terms on every single engagement. These findings were compiled into formal intelligence summaries and distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet by March 1943. Every fighter squadron received detailed briefings. The information was mandatory knowledge for all naval aviators, but knowing how to beat the Zero was meaningless without an aircraft capable of executing the tactics. The F6F Wildcat, despite its rugged construction and pilot protection, simply didn't have the performance envelope necessary. Its maximum speed of 318 miles per hour was barely faster than the Zero's 331. Its climb rate was inferior. Its acceleration was inadequate. What the Navy needed desperately was a fighter that could maintain decisive speed superiority while executing the high-speed tactics that Hoffman's testing had validated. That fighter was already in advanced production on Long Island, New York, rolling off Grumman's assembly lines at rates that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been designed from the beginning with one primary objective: defeat the Zero in combat. Roy Grumman and his engineering team had studied every combat report, analyzed every pilot debriefing, and examined captured Zero components with obsessive attention to detail. They understood that the Hellcat would never outturn the Zero in slow-speed combat. That was physics, not engineering. With armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure required for carrier operations, the Hellcat would inevitably be heavier than the Zero. But Grumman made a decisive engineering choice: accept the weight penalty and compensate entirely through overwhelming engine power. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double-wasp 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the Zero's 940. This enormous power advantage allowed the Hellcat to maintain decisive speed superiority, despite weighing 7,800 pounds fully loaded, 2,245 pounds heavier than the Zero. The Hellcat's maximum speed reached 380 miles per hour at 17,000 feet altitude, 49 miles per hour faster than the Zero. That speed differential was the gap between controlling engagement geometry and being controlled by it. The climb rate at combat power exceeded 3,500 feet per minute, matching or exceeding the Zero's climb performance, despite the substantial weight difference. Most critically, the Hellcat maintained full control effectiveness and structural integrity at speeds where the Zero became dangerously uncontrollable. The Hellcat could roll rapidly at 300 miles per hour. It could dive away from threats using negative G, without engine failure. It could sustain high G maneuvering at high speed without risk of wing failure. Grumman's design philosophy emphasized rugged simplicity and ease of maintenance. Every component was accessible. Every system was designed for serviceability under terrible conditions by exhausted mechanics on carrier decks. The modular construction meant battle damage could be repaired quickly. Bullet holes could be patched. Damaged components could be replaced. The Hellcat was designed to bring pilots home alive. By February 1943, Hellcats were arriving at Pacific Fleet squadrons in increasing numbers. VF-9 aboard the carrier Essex received the first operational Hellcats and began intensive training in the new aircraft and new tactics. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats immediately noticed the Hellcat's superior performance. The acceleration was dramatic. The climb rate was exhilarating. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent. The 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, delivered devastating firepower. But more important than performance specifications was the psychological transformation the Hellcat enabled. American pilots no longer approached combat with the sick dread that had characterized encounters with Zeros in 1942. They entered engagements confident that their aircraft would do exactly what they asked. The engine wouldn't quit, the guns wouldn't jam, the airframe wouldn't fail. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics and decisive action. The first major combat test came in August 1943 during Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Hellcat squadrons flew combat air patrol above the invasion fleet and conducted fighter sweeps over Japanese-held atolls. The results validated everything the testing and training had promised. Hellcat pilots shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft while suffering minimal losses. The kill ratios were dramatically better than anything achieved with Wildcats. Japanese pilots initially dismissed the Hellcat as just another heavy American fighter, similar to the Wildcat but perhaps slightly faster. Combat reports from Japanese aviators who survived encounters with Hellcats in late 1943 reflect genuine confusion about American tactics. They described American fighters that refused to turn, that dove away from pursuit, that attacked from above with devastating speed and firepower before disengaging before Japanese pilots could respond. This was incomprehensible from the Japanese tactical perspective. In their doctrine, refusing to turn represented cowardice or poor piloting skill. A fighter pilot's honor demanded acceptance of close combat on equal terms. The American approach seemed to violate fundamental principles of aerial warfare. Japanese pilots trained to force turning engagements interpreted American diving attacks and rapid disengagement as evidence of inferior flying ability or mechanical problems with American aircraft. Japanese intelligence assessments from early 1944 show systematic misunderstanding of what was happening tactically. Reports describe the Hellcat as slower in maneuverability compared to the Zero, emphasizing the Zero's continued superiority in turning radius and climb rate from low altitude. These assessments were technically accurate but tactically irrelevant because American pilots never fought in the regime where Japanese advantages mattered. The critical misunderstanding was structural and cultural. Japanese tactical doctrine remained rooted in the samurai ideal of personal combat skill, demonstrated through close-quarters maneuvering. Their training emphasized dogfighting ability, individual pilot technique, and aircraft agility. The concept of deliberately avoiding the enemy's strengths while ruthlessly exploiting his weaknesses through systematic tactical discipline was philosophically alien. By April 1944, Hellcat production at Grumman's Bethpage factory reached 14 aircraft per day, one complete fighter every 103 minutes around the clock. The Navy had 12 Hellcat squadrons operational in the Pacific, with more forming constantly. Every carrier task force included at least one full Hellcat squadron of 36 aircraft. The industrial capacity that had seemed impossible in 1942 was now reality. Japanese aircraft production, meanwhile, was struggling under increasing resource constraints and American bombing. Total Japanese fighter production in 1944 would reach approximately 9,000 aircraft of all types across all manufacturers. Grumman alone would build 6,139 Hellcats in calendar year 1944, nearly matching total Japanese fighter output from a single factory producing a single aircraft type. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation that would end Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. In June 1944, American forces prepared to invade the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, which would bring B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy understood the strategic significance completely. If the Marianas fell, Japan itself would be subject to systematic strategic bombing. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, ordered Operation Eigo, a massive naval counterattack intended to destroy the American invasion fleet through concentrated carrier airstrikes. The Japanese committed 9 aircraft carriers with approximately 450 embarked aircraft to the operation. It would be the largest carrier aviation battle in history and the final test of Japanese confidence in the Zero's superiority. The Japanese pilots launching from their carriers on the morning of June 19, 1944, carried that confidence with them into combat. They had been trained to believe their aircraft was superior. They had been taught that American pilots feared them. They had been told that forcing Americans into turning combat would result in inevitable victory. They flew toward the American fleet, expecting to achieve the decisive victory that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. Instead, they flew directly into carefully prepared defensive systems designed specifically to destroy them with industrial efficiency. The American defensive arrangement above the Philippine Sea on June 19th represented the culmination of 2 years of tactical evolution and industrial mobilization. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from his flagship, the carrier Lexington. His force included 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The carriers embarked 450 Hellcat fighters specifically configured for air superiority missions. Mitcher's fighter director officers had rehearsed the defensive plan exhaustively. Radar provided early warning of incoming Japanese formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter direction teams vectored Hellcat combat air patrols toward threats with precision, stacking altitude layers to ensure interception before Japanese aircraft could reach the fleet. Every Hellcat pilot knew his assigned altitude, his patrol sector, and his engagement procedures. The Japanese attack waves began launching at 8:30 in the morning. The first wave consisted of 69 aircraft, primarily Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers and Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bombers escorted by 43 Zero fighters. They flew toward the American fleet in tight formation at 24,000 feet altitude, confident in their numbers and their training. American radar detected them at 10:15, range 92 miles. Fighter directors immediately vectored multiple Hellcat divisions toward the threat. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer led the first intercept, climbing to 26,000 feet to achieve altitude advantage. His division of 4 Hellcats positioned themselves directly between the sun and the incoming Japanese formation, invisible until they chose to attack. Brewer waited until range closed to 2 miles before ordering the attack. His division rolled into diving passes from 6,000 feet above the Japanese formation. The tactical geometry was perfect. The Hellcats dove at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, far faster than the heavily loaded Japanese bombers could maneuver. Each Hellcat pilot selected a target, closed to an optimal firing range of 300 yards, and opened fire with all 6 50-caliber machine guns. The effect was devastating. Japanese bombers disintegrated under concentrated fire. The lightweight construction that made Japanese aircraft so maneuverable made them catastrophically vulnerable to sustained machine gun fire. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through aluminum skin, severed control cables, ignited fuel tanks, and killed pilots and crew instantly. Within 90 seconds, Brewer's division destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft without sustaining a single hit in return. The surviving Japanese bombers scattered, their formation integrity destroyed. Zero escorts attempted to engage the attacking Hellcats, but the American fighters simply dove away, using superior speed to open range before the Zeros could achieve firing position. The Hellcats then climbed back to altitude using energy gained in their diving attacks, reversed position, and attacked again from advantageous altitude. Japanese Zero pilots found themselves fighting opponents who refused every attempt to force turning combat. Every time a Zero maneuvered into position behind a Hellcat, the American pilot dove away at full throttle, often pulling negative G deliberately to ensure the Zero's engine would die. It attempted pursuit. By the time the Zero pilot restarted his engine and regained situational awareness, the Hellcat had already climbed back above him and was positioning for another diving attack. The tactical frustration was complete. Zero pilots possessed superior aircraft for slow-speed maneuvering combat, but they never got the opportunity to demonstrate that superiority. American pilots imposed high-speed hit-and-run tactics that exploited every mechanical limitation the Zero possessed. The ailerons that froze at high speed, the carburetor that failed under negative G, the thin skin that couldn't withstand 50-caliber fire, the lack of armor that made every hit potentially fatal. The first Japanese attack wave lost 42 aircraft before reaching the American fleet. Only 27 aircraft penetrated to attack range, and anti-aircraft fire from the battleships and cruisers destroyed most of those. Fewer than 10 Japanese aircraft survived to return to their carriers. The attack achieved negligible damage, hitting just one battleship with a bomb that caused minor casualties. The second wave launched at 1100 hours, with 109 aircraft. They received the same reception. Hellcat combat air patrols intercepted them 70 miles from the fleet. The slaughter repeated with mechanical efficiency, diving attacks from altitude, concentrated fire at close range, immediate disengagement before Japanese fighters could respond, zoom climbs back to altitude, repeated attacks until ammunition was exhausted. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrasiu's 6 kills in 8 minutes was exceptional but not unique. Across the battle space, multiple Hellcat pilots achieved 4 or 5 kills in single engagements. Ensign Wilbur Webb shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in 12 minutes. Lieutenant Cecil Harris destroyed 4 bombers in a single diving pass. The kill counts accumulated throughout the afternoon with mathematical inevitability. Japanese pilots, who survived the gauntlet and reached their carriers, reported encounters that seemed impossible. They described American fighters that appeared from nowhere, destroyed entire formations in seconds, and disappeared before defensive action was possible. They described aircraft that refused combat on Japanese terms, that seemed invulnerable to counterattack, that operated with coordination that suggested supernatural awareness. The reports reflected genuine psychological shock. Japanese tactical doctrine provided no framework for understanding what was happening. Their training emphasized individual pilot skill and aircraft superiority. They had neither advantage against Hellcats flown by pilots executing coordinated tactics based on accurate intelligence about Japanese aircraft limitations. By 1600 hours, Japanese carriers had launched 4 major attack waves, totaling 373 aircraft. American forces had destroyed 330 of them. The few dozen survivors that made it back to their carriers landed with tales of catastrophic defeat. Many aircraft ditched in the ocean when fuel ran out. Their pilots never recovered. Japanese carriers that had launched full strike packages recovered handfuls of aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into June 20th, with further American attacks on Japanese carriers, but the decisive blow had already fallen. Japanese naval aviation lost not just aircraft, but experienced pilots who could never be replaced. The training pipeline that had produced skilled aviators in 1941 and 1942 had collapsed under wartime attrition. Replacement pilots arriving at frontline squadrons in mid-1944 had perhaps 100 to 200 hours total flight time compared to the 1,000-plus hours veteran pilots had accumulated before Pearl Harbor. The combination of inexperienced pilots flying tactically obsolete aircraft against numerically superior opponents, flying technically superior fighters, executing optimized tactics created a death spiral. Every engagement produced lopsided casualties that degraded Japanese capability further. The attrition was unsustainable. The 2 months following the Marianas Turkey shoot saw this pattern repeat across the Pacific theater. In July 1944, American forces invaded Guam and Tinian. Hellcat squadrons flew continuous combat air patrol and ground attack missions. Japanese air opposition was sporadic and ineffective. 0 fighters attempting to interfere with American operations were destroyed systematically. In August 1944, carrier task forces struck the Bonaire Islands, neutralizing Japanese air bases that threatened the Marianas supply lines. Hellcats conducted fighter sweeps over enemy airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and shooting down anything that attempted to take off. The kill ratios remained catastrophically one-sided. For every Hellcat lost, 15 to 20 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Japanese commanders recognized the crisis but lacked resources to address it. New fighter designs like the Kawanishi N1K2J Shiden offered improved performance and better protection, but production numbers remained trivially small. The Mitsubishi A7M Repu, designed as the true Zero replacement, never reached operational squadrons before war's end. Japan continued producing Zeros because there was no alternative, building aircraft that were obsolete the day they left the factory. By September 1944, the statistical reality was undeniable. In the 2-month period from mid-June through mid-August, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 270 Zero fighters in combat with Hellcats across the Philippine Sea, the Marianas, the Bonins, and the Western Pacific. American Hellcat losses during the same period totaled fewer than 30 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio exceeded 9-1, approaching the 19-1 overall ratio that Hellcats would achieve across the entire Pacific War. The Japanese response revealed the depth of their strategic desperation. Unable to defeat American fighters through conventional tactics, unable to produce aircraft in numbers sufficient to overwhelm through quantity, unable to train pilots fast enough to replace losses, Japanese commanders turned to the only resource that remained unlimited, the willingness of young men to die for their emperor. The kamikaze program began formally in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Zero fighters, stripped of unnecessary equipment and loaded with 550-pound bombs, deliberately crashed into American ships. The lightweight airframe designed for maneuverability and range now carried explosives on one-way, suicide missions. The aircraft that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 became guided missiles piloted by teenagers with barely enough training to take off and maintain formation. The philosophical circle was complete. The obsession with offensive capability that led engineers to delete all defensive equipment in 1941 culminated in using the aircraft itself as a weapon. The features that made the Zero legendary now made it ideal for suicide attacks. Long range meant it could reach distant targets. Simplicity meant minimally trained pilots could fly straight courses toward ships. Lightweight meant it could carry substantial explosive payloads, but even kamikaze tactics couldn't reverse the fundamental imbalance. American carriers deployed increasing numbers of Hellcats on combat air patrol specifically to intercept suicide attackers. The same tactics that devastated conventional Japanese strikes proved equally effective against kamikazes. Hellcat pilots shot down suicide aircraft long before they reached the fleet. Those that penetrated the fighter screen faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with radar-directed guns and proximity-fused ammunition. The statistical effectiveness of kamikaze attacks remained low despite dramatic individual successes. Most suicide aircraft were destroyed before reaching targets. Most hits caused damage rather than sinkings. American industrial capacity replaced damaged ships faster than kamikaze attacks could destroy them. The tactic imposed psychological costs on American sailors, but achieved negligible strategic impact. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.